Welcome to the Association's Futures Podcast, brought to you by Association Activision. We ask you to join us to discuss the future of the Association's community. How can we build and focus on the many futures we will see during these disruptive times? Let's get started with today's guest.
Welcome, Jeff De Cagna, AIMP, FRSA FASAE. He is the executive advisor for Foresight First LLC, located in Reston, Virginia. An association contrarian, foresight practitioner, governing designer, stakeholder successor advocate, and stewardship catalyst. In August 2019, Jeff became the 32nd recipient of ASAE's Academy of Leaders Award, the association's highest individual honor given to consultants or industry partners in recognition of their support of ASAE and the association communion. I'm your host, Michael Butera. Welcome, Jeff, to the podcast.
Thanks very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to join you for this conversation. I'm always happy to see you.
Well, let's talk about the duty of foresight. Why? Why is it important to mark the 10-year milestone on the board's duty of foresight?
Well, I appreciate you starting there, because this is the year in which I'm marking the 10-year milestone of the board's duty of foresight, having written about it for the first time in 2014, coined the phrase and built this concept over the course of the last 10 years. I wrote about it in Associations Now. And I think it's important because 10 years later, 120 months later, not quite, it was the summer of 2014. So I'm marking it throughout the year, but the actual, if you want to be technical about it, the actual 10-year milestone comes a few months from now. But I think it's important to remind ourselves, to remind boards, to remind our community that anticipating the future, adapting to the future is not an optional activity. We've learned a lot in these last 10 years, and especially since the start of this decade, why it is so important to have a consistent practice of foresight. And the underpinning of a consistent practice of foresight is the board's duty of foresight, because that's the group that is going to sustain the momentum for the practice of foresight in our organization. So for me, the milestone is not a celebration. I don't see this as a celebration of me or even really a celebration of the idea. I'm just simply wanting to remind our community that this is important. This is an opportunity to reinforce the importance of the work of foresight and the duty of foresight and the practice of foresight, and also a renewed invitation to boards, to CEOs, and to other decision makers in our community to make foresight a priority. The pandemic taught us many important lessons, lessons we do not want to have to endure again. And so I think that the duty of foresight is the opportunity for every association to build that capacity for anticipation and adaptation, and to build its resilience for decision-making under very difficult conditions, which we've been experiencing for a long time now and will continue to experience in an accelerated, intensified way as this decade continues.
Jeff, all of us are engaged in many journeys in our life. And I've often heard you talk about your journey to foresight by your understanding of what happened at BlackBerry. How about filling us in?
Yeah, I like to think that I appreciate you asking that question about, how did this come about? And I think, even my earlier work as an advisor and speaker and consultant associations, there was always an element of let's focus on the future. When I was doing work on innovation for a long period of time with associations, when I started back in 2002, that future element is kind of built into the idea of innovation. But I think that where foresight really became critical for me, and it started even before I wrote the article in 2014, I had the opportunity to go to the Oxford Scenarios program at the Said Business School in the UK, and spent some time there, which was a fantastic learning experience, and that really was a way of deepening my thinking about the future and helping me build my capacity for developing scenarios. But I think what happened in 2014 became the inflection point, in a sense, for this work for me. And I wrote this article that I mentioned earlier about, well, the article itself was about BlackBerry. And the reason why I wrote it that year, I wrote two articles in particular that started out as innovation articles, and one was about a company. Both were companies that people were familiar with. One was about a company that everyone knew that had innovated its way to staggering success, and they've been sustaining it over a period of time. That company was Amazon. And then I decided to write another article about a company that had a similar kind of process of staggering success through innovation, but then lost it. How could they have lost that success? How could they go from being a dominant player to being an also ran? And that was the article that I wrote about BlackBerry. And I think that for me, the journey into Foresight, that from that inflection point, was really about seeing how a company that everyone knew of, understood, like recognized the name, and so many of us were customers, and I was, a very loyal customer, had multiple BlackBerries over the course of my life. How could they? How could it go so wrong, right, in their organizations? And so, researching that article and seeing what happened there, and recognizing that that board and really the management team as well, the co-CEOs of the company, really could not, they had difficulty imagining a world in which their business model would not be dominant. And it was in that article that I said, okay, this board has failed at its duty of foresight. They could not contemplate how external forces, whether it was a company like Apple or a company like Google or a company, or just simply shifts in the marketplace, consumer preferences, customer preferences, they could not conceive of how that could be different until it actually happened to them, and they could not recover. So for me, the BlackBerry experience was an early warning, or was a clear warning for associations, that if it can happen to a company like that, the dominant, not just the dominant handset company, the dominant mobile phone company, if you want to put it that way, of its time, but the dominant technology company of the period. Everyone was talking about BlackBerry in the late 90s into the early 2000s, and even into the late 2000s, long after they were already on a downward spiral. They were still a dominant player, a cultural phenomenon, right up until they weren't, right? And so that was a very clear warning to all of us that if that could happen to them, it could happen to any organization, including associations. And that was crucial for me. And it became the reason why I really pursued this pathway of wanting to build the capacity of boards to operate in a world in which the conditions are unforgiving, and they need to be better prepared for any possibility that's in front of them, including the highly plausible futures that they will not want to befall their organizations in the same way that the similar kinds of unfavorable and unthinkable futures befell BlackBerry.
Well, as a follow-up to that answer, Jeff, why do you think that the duty of foresight remains a radical notion even now in 2024?
Well, yeah, I think it was a very radical idea back in 2014 because no one had ever suggested the idea that a board had a duty of foresight, and I'm not a lawyer, so I look at this through the lens of someone who has worked with boards for a long time, who has served on boards, who has been a board officer, a board chair of a national nonprofit. And I think that the duty of foresight was a radical idea in 2014 because we just simply assumed that the three duties for boards were the duties of care, loyalty, and obedience, fiduciary responsibility, and that was probably the extent of it. There may be some other things that boards did, but those were the things that boards had to focus on because they were required, they were mandated, and they remain so today. So the proposal that there would be another duty that boards would have was a radical idea. And again, I'm not saying that because I'm celebrating myself. I'm saying it because it simply had never been discussed before. And I know that because that was the reaction at the time. And so I think in 2024, it remains a radical idea, even though one can say, okay, we've been talking about it for 10 years. It started out as something that no one had discussed, and then I've been talking about it and writing about it. It's found its way into ASAE's professional practices publication that is part of the material that CAE candidates use to prepare for the exam. So it's been somewhat accepted into what we talk about in the association community. It's been discussed. But I think it still remains a radical idea in 2024 because it pushes us to challenge the orthodoxy of what boards are supposed to do. We still, in 2024, assume that the primary function of boards is to perform these very specific traditional activities that boards have always done throughout their history, certainly throughout their recent history. And yet, in 2024, where we find ourselves, right, as I alluded to earlier, the challenges before us require a fundamentally different approach on the part of association boards to be able to navigate these challenges. We cannot simply ask our boards to perform a revised or revamped or slightly different approach to the same kinds of work. We need to change the work. We need to change the focus. And so it challenges all the orthodoxy that exists around boards. It challenges us to think in a fundamentally different way about what it is boards need to do. We know that boards are human systems, guiding human systems into the future. You can't do that. You can't be that kind of entity if you are not pursuing the work of foresight, if you are not serious about the duty of foresight. So I think that that's an issue that remains present. And so for me, what's radical about the duty of foresight is that it continues to push us and to challenge boards to figure out how they become fit for purpose, how they become more in their work, and how they move their organizations through this very difficult time, which will not be easy, but giving them a way to move beyond coping. I think in many ways that is also why it's a radical idea, is that we have to move ourselves and our boards beyond the idea of coping with the challenges that we face, figuring out how to operate in that fashion, and get to a place where boards are reasserting their agency to shape the futures, to stand up for the futures of their successors. I think that's another aspect of why this remains a radical idea. And I want it, honestly, to remain a radical idea because it is a choice and it does imply additional choices for how boards will conduct their work as we move into the second half of this decade and beyond.
Well, before we delve a little deeper into this concept of human systems in the future, something that you said has brought a new thing to my thinking here. So I would never shortchange the idea of fiduciary responsibility. It's the law, there's regulations. But I'm wondering that from a foresight perspective, if the manner in which legal counsel and accountants, the business side of it all, doesn't make boards think old-fashioned, so to speak, and to not see the duty of foresight as important as you're actually making it. You're saying, look, this is a fiduciary responsibility too, even though it's not in the law. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, look, I've got lots of friends who are attorneys and auditors and accountants, and probably people who work in professions that don't begin with the letter A. And they have important roles to play, right? Counsel is essential to the work of boards and what auditors do in terms of helping boards understand internal controls and ensure the internal financial management of the organization is sound and their fiduciary duty is fulfilled. And certainly the same with accountants in terms of financial oversight and budgeting and policies related to that. It's all very important, as you say. I've been a board member. I've been a board officer, so I I agree with that, right? And I certainly wanted to fulfill my fiduciary responsibility. And when I started talking about, when I first wrote about and started talking about the duty of foresight, my initial thought was, well, maybe this is something we do want to pursue as a fourth duty that would be part of fiduciary duty. What would even be the pathway to make that happen, right? I spoke with some attorney friends of mine and got some perspective on how they saw what I was writing about, and and from their perspective, and I think probably from any attorney's perspective, they would look at the duty of foresight as maybe something underneath the duty of care. I don't agree with that interpretation, because the only aspect of the duty of care, in my opinion, that really relates to any notion of foresight, and again, not an attorney, so I'm articulating this in the way that I thought about it as a director and officer, and the way that I would describe it as an advisor to someone who's serving on a board, but I would certainly never want to challenge the legal interpretation that counsel might provide. But for me, the duty of care is about what's the foreseeability of the consequences of our decisions, right? And that's a very specific way of thinking about how we look toward the future. What the duty of foresight is about, this idea that it requires boards to stand up for their successors' futures. That's the next definition of the duty of foresight that I codified in 2022 after 8 years of a very stable definition that was really about making a shared commitment to learn as much as possible with the future. That was what I was, sort of suggesting boards needed to do. Now in 2022 or in 2022 and later up until today, the definition is really about requiring boards to stand up for their successors' futures through intentional learning, through short-term sacrifice, which is making sacrifices today to benefit those who will come later, and to take long-term action, right? The grounding of that duty is not in the law. It's not in case law. It's not in statute. It's not in regulation. It is in our shared humanity. Not all duties are grounded or have to be grounded in the law. We can ground this duty in the idea that we owe something to one another to make our organization successful. And we certainly owe something to our successors that we will never know personally, particularly those that will never cross our pathways. So what do we owe to them? We owe them every opportunity that we can take today to anticipate what their worlds could look like, to make decisions today in 2024 that will accrue to their benefit over time. And even if it means we have to give something up, to make learning a priority. And that is the key difference really between the duty of care and the duty of foresight. There's nothing really in the duty of care that implies or directly states that boards have to do any kind of learning, right, about related to the future. They have no affirmative responsibility for that. In the definition of the duty of foresight, the next definition that I just referenced, there's an affirmative duty to learn with the future, intentional learning. You must do that work. And I think that we'd be remiss if we weren't challenging boards to say, you've got this responsibility, because if you don't do it, who will do it, right? Who will take this on? And yes, you could say, well, we'll have a task force or hire a consultant or something like that. They can't do it for you, right? They can help you. But ultimately, boards are responsible for their associations. They have the authority to make decisions for their associations, and they have the opportunity to do this work because we know they'll meet 2 or 3 or 4 more times per year. So they're the only group really that fits all 3 of those categories. Staff can't do it. Consultants can't do it. Committees or task forces can't do it. They don't have all 3 of those attributes. So for me, the duty of foresight is an ethical choice. It's a smart choice. It's a moral choice. It's the choice that boards should be making for themselves and for their current stakeholders and long-term successors. And it doesn't take away from fiduciary duty. In fact, I think the duty of foresight amplifies and intensifies and offers new perspectives on fiduciary duty. And I think it's very important for us to situate this all in context and go back to what I said earlier, which is the work of boards needs to change. The function of boards needs to change. The purpose of boards needs to change. And I think the duty of foresight provides a starting point for how we can make those changes for the benefit of our organizations, those that it serves, and also, quite honestly, for the benefit of the directors and officers that serve on those boards. This is good for them too, in terms of building their capacity as decision makers and building their attractiveness, if you will, as contributors in other contexts, because people who build these kinds of capabilities are always going to be in demand in whatever way we might be looking for human contribution.
When you were talking about the duty of foresight as a radical notion, you mentioned this idea that while you referred to boards as human systems responsible for guiding human systems into the future, explore that a little bit more for the audience.
Sure. So when you take away all the particulars, and we've been talking about a lot of the things that boards are asked to do. Boards have to perform these fiduciary duties, and that involves reviewing documents, reviewing budgets, providing oversight, developing policies. All of work that I've done with boards over the years, all work I've done as a board member as well. Again, all very important and necessary. None of that is unimportant. None of it is diminished in its contribution to the success of the organization. But those are the traditional activities, right, of boards. And so when you take all of that away, those traditional activities, and just kind of set them aside for a moment, and then all the other activities that we often put on boards as well, that they have to play the role of an ambassador, or they have to give money, or whatever other aspects we want boards to take on. We asked, when I was a board member, I was asked to thank exhibitors, that kind of thing. If we take that all away, when you get to the foundational level of what a board is, why a board exists, what the purpose of it is a human system, right? The people at the table, and it's a system that goes beyond the people who are actually on the board. They're just the core element of that system. The system includes staff partners, right? The CEO and other staff partners who work with them. It includes committees and task forces and other groups whose work contributes to what the board does. It involves these other partners that we were talking about earlier, accountants and advisors and auditors and attorneys and people like me who would serve as a board advisor, and others who work with boards. We're all part of that human system, right? But the board is the core of the human system for any association, with all of these additional connections, if you will, to this network of relationships. That human system, the board and everyone working with them, is responsible for guiding the association, which in and of itself is a human system into the future, right? It's a human system of staff. It's a human system of members. It's a human system of other stakeholders, of partners who provide services, of relationships you have with other entities. Those human systems have to be guided by someone. They are guided by the board. Now, to add to that, there are other systems within which association boards also have responsibility. So if you're a part of an ecosystem in healthcare, or in accounting and finance, or in technology, or whatever ecosystem your association operates in, what a board does for its own association is not limited in impact to just that group. It also affects the rest of the ecosystem. Decisions made in one part of the ecosystem will have ripple effects across that system. So if you're working in a profession or industry, one association's decisions will have an effect on other associations, other entities within that system. They're also responsible for guiding that system, that human system of the profession, of the industry, of the field into the future, right? In addition, there may be specific smaller relationship groups or networks, if you will, that an association is a part of. Some associations form collaborations or coalitions or other kinds of multi-stakeholder ways of working together. Once again, the decisions of the board in any one part of that can have an effect. Plus, if they're coming together for collaborative decision making, then those decisions also have an effect on the system. So there's multiple ways in which boards are responsible as a group of human beings working with others who are partnering with them, collaborating with them, supporting them, are guiding that system, the core system of the association, plus these other overlapping relationships that associations build that are also human systems, because it's all about people. We've not yet, we're not quite there to the robot overlords taking over yet, but maybe we'll get there one day. Hopefully not. But right now it's all about what human beings do together, and the boards are the ones who are ultimately responsible for making sure these systems are functioning properly, for regulating them, if you will, regulating in the sense of making sure that they have the right, coherence, capability, and continuity, which is part of the definition of governing that I use, that they're stewarding them into the future. They're bringing that sense of stewardship to making sure they're leaving these systems better than how they found them, for the benefit of stakeholders and successors. That's what I mean by, boards are human systems. And it's really hard to do everything I just described without the idea of the duty of foresight. That if you can't anticipate and adapt, prepare, bring your agency to bear on moving your organization, your systems forward, it's going to be a very challenging process if we're situating our decision-making exclusively in the present day without that long-term view, without that commitment to sacrifice for those who follow us, without that intentional learning. That is all part of the definition of the duty of foresight. So that's what I mean. And for me, it's so foundational to how we have to think about boards in the 2020s and going forward. Because if we just think about them as a group that performs these traditional activities that they've been assigned for decades, then it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be a struggle. And I think we've seen that struggle play itself out before the pandemic, and then the return to complacency following the pandemic has been a reminder that that's where we are once again, in the same or a very similar place to the conditions that created so many problems for us during the worst of the pandemic lockdown. And I think it's time for us to really recognize the need for a foundational shift.
In an earlier presentation that I saw you make, you talked about an American anthropologist who has created a work around this concept of BANI, that is brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible, and why, that concept versus what we know as a better known concept, which is VUCA, which is, of course, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Speak to us a little bit about that concept and how it fits into the duty of foresight conversation.
Yeah, so Jemai Cascio, who is a futurist anthropologist, in 2018, he started writing about the idea of BANI. Again, not my favorite acronym, but the words that you just shared are the right words. And the reason why I agree with him that we need to shift away from VUCA and toward BANI, and it took me a while really to get there. And I think really what helped me get there was thinking about was frankly the arrival, getting closer to the arrival of the 10-year milestone of the duty of foresight, because I really began to think about what he was saying, right, which was VUCA was useful for about 30 years. It started in the military and it spread to other sectors, became more popularized. I certainly wrote about it for periods of time. I actually even wrote, sort of suggested alternatives to it that were a little different from this. But I think that, VUCA is we still have a volatile environment. We still have tremendous amounts of uncertainty. We still have tremendous complexity and ambiguity. It's not gone away. It's just too prevalent for it to be a useful way of framing up our thinking about the future. It's not a great tool. It's more of a blunt instrument in 2024. Certainly, it was probably slightly less blunt in 2018. So I appreciate the anticipation that Jemai Cascio, showed in that. But I think where we are now, almost 5 years into this decade, but kind of 2 years beyond the worst of the pandemic lockdown, we can really see now what the consequences have been. And I think these words that he's used here, the brittleness of our systems across society, the brittleness of physical systems, the electrical system, the water system, supply chain, the food system, educational systems, both tangibly in terms of infrastructure, our national infrastructure as well. Our political system is more brittle. You name it. Certainly, the environment is an enormously brittle system. We live in a world of brittle systems that are very hard to make more resilient without tremendous investment of time, energy, and resources. So the brittleness is going to persist. The next time that there's stress, and by the way, they are being stressed even as we speak, but the next time there's very concentrated stress on them, like a global pandemic, which we will incur these kinds of situations again. Right now, we're in a multi-crisis or poly-crisis kind of world with two wars going on and multiple challenges happening across different forces and factors that shape the future. That brittleness is not going away, right? This creates a lot of anxiety among just every human being, among decision makers. That anxiety is not going away. We can see in a world of more brittle systems and more complexity that an input in one part of the system doesn't necessarily result in a clear A to B to C kind of output. There's more nonlinearity in the environment, more situations where unexpected things occur that can have detrimental impact. We're dealing with technologies now that create those kinds of situations. Artificial intelligence is a good example of technologies that create more sort of nonlinear developments. And also, these technologies are not well understood even by those who develop them. There's a real asymmetry in our understanding of artificial intelligence. Those who have deep knowledge from decades of experience with it and being involved on the front lines of its development. And then there's billions of people worldwide who are in some way having their lives touched by artificial intelligence, either through its intentional use or through its integration into products that we all use every day without us necessarily giving our consent to it being used. But these technologies are incomprehensible in terms of their outputs that they create, the way that they get to those predictions. So you can see how these four words capture kind of where we see ourselves in 2024 and where we're headed. And for me, the duty of foresight is a great fit with thinking about this, because think about what the duty of foresight is about, right? The words in the duty of foresight. Intentional learning. First, it starts with stand up for our successors' futures. So these terms, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible, are words that are currently defining what's happening and how we see our future going into the rest of this decade and toward the 2030s. So we got to stand up for that future, right? That's one. Two, in the definition itself, right? The idea of we've got to have intentional learning. Well, these are areas where we can do intentional learning. How do we address issues of brittleness by creating more resilience? How do we address issues of anxiety by bringing more empathy? How do we address issues of non-linearity by creating more slack in the system so we can better understand what's happening? How do we address issues of incomprehensibility by building our capacity to understand the implications of various phenomena? There's a lot of room for intentional learning there, right? There's a lot of room for sacrifice. How can we give up something today that will benefit those who follow us versus accruing all the benefits to ourselves? And there's a lot of room for a long-term view, taking long-term action. Let's make choices in 2024 that will not only serve us well today, but will set the table for future decisions by future boards about how they move the organization on a trajectory towards something better, toward a more thrivable future, if that is possible to achieve. So for me, the duty of foresight and everything that goes along with it that we've already talked about in our conversation is really fits well with figuring out how we navigate through this banny world. And I'm sure that as we go forward, I said earlier that I came up with the next definition of the duty of foresight in 2022. I chose to call it that because I knew that there'd be another definition at some point going forward. And I don't know when that'll be, but I know it will come. And I'm sure there'll come a point in time as well when Jemai or someone else will say, you know what, we've moved beyond Banny, just as we are probably moving beyond VUCA. I doubt it'll be 30 years before we say, okay, it's really this. It's the next acronym. So I think we have to be adaptive in that way too. These 4 words, these 4 letters describe, I think, pretty well where we are, but it won't necessarily describe exactly where we are. Maybe as we get to the 2030s, we may decide, hey, you know what? In the 2030s, these are the words we need to be focused on. But for right now, this next definition and this acronym, this framing, if you will, better way to say it, is helpful for us to think about what boards do and how they do it, and how they can shift their perspectives on what their role is and the contribution they need to make.
I want to ask you about your movement in terms of your definition of the duty of foresight. But before I do that, when I work with boards and executives, one of the things I see that I think is a mistake that is often made by boards and executives is they think of foresight as some kind of future predictor. We're going to predict the future. And for me, it's not about predicting the future with any kind of certainty, but rather about considering multiple possible futures to make better decisions today. So as you revised your earlier duty of foresight definition, tell us how you now see that definition and why the change.
Well, I think that, you're absolutely right that there is this sensibility, and I see it all the time because I put surveys out there in which I often ask the question, what does foresight mean to you personally and professionally? And the 2 words that most come up most often in responses to those questions across surveys, across contexts, is that foresight is about planning and prediction, right? I think part of the reason why that's the case is because that's just the common sensibility, right? People are familiar with the term, for example, of scenario planning, right? Which also got its start in the military. And militaries, as you well know, Michael, are well known for their focus on planning. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Planning is a necessary function for us to perform. But I like to disconnect. I've always wanted to disconnect the idea of planning from foresight. And the definition I use of foresight is an intentional process of learning with the future. There are more technical definitions that people have, more words in them, more complicated, and that's fine. If you prefer a different definition, you should pursue it. For me, foresight as an intentional process of learning with the future captures it because that's what we need to be doing, right? And it is about understanding multiple plausible futures that could come about for our organizations. It's not about, for me, about a prediction, right? And let's just be clear about what we mean, right? If I were to say to you that in March 2034, this will happen, X will happen, that's a prediction, right? We can all get together in March of 2034 and see if it comes true. If I were to say to you in March of 2034, there's a 75% chance that X will happen, that's a forecast, right? It's a very simplistic way of describing it, I admit, but it's good to make a distinction. When I talk about foresight, what I mean is, what could the world look like in March of 2034? Right? What are the plausible futures, the plausible scenarios that could emerge? What's a favorable future that could emerge? What's an unfavorable future? What's an unthinkable future? Literally the worst case scenario. Let's make sure we're looking at each one of those, right? And we're never considering more than 3 or 4 futures at a time. It's too much complexity to ask someone to deal with more than that. Even 3 or 4 can be a challenge, but going beyond that, it's just not possible. So it's about exploring those futures. And particularly now, another aspect to our previous part of our conversation is, how can you shape those futures in a way where you're really taking a hard look at the brittleness of systems within those futures and the anxiety within those systems? Because, another aspect of the anxiety thing I just want to add right here, since we're talking about it, is we can't ignore the emotional aspect that people confront when they're dealing with the future. A big part of the resistance to this is because people are fearful of the future right now. I think there's always been a built-in fear of the future, but they're fearful of the future perhaps even more so right now because of everything that's happening, because of the climate crisis and because of AI, and particularly with the AI aspect of things. I think one of the things we have to understand with regard to people's fears is that the people who are involved in developing artificial intelligence have a real science fiction way of looking at things, right? They're all grew up on science fiction. And so when you hear how they talk about it, when you read articles, when you look at visuals that you see across our society, across our media outlets, social media, news media, and so on, you see a real sci-fi component to the way we think about it. And there's a legitimate contribution that science fiction has made to the work of foresight. I'm not in any way suggesting otherwise. But I do think that much of the way we talk about some of the issues does evoke, the sense of fear. And I'm guilty of it too, just like anybody else. Part of the reason why I do it is because I don't know how else to move the needle, to be perfectly honest, because when I try to present it in other ways, people don't necessarily respond. So as an educator, I don't like using fear as a motivator, and you're an educator too, so I'm sure you agree with me. Fear is not a great motivator, but it appears to be the only option we have for ourselves right now, which is why when we're considering multiple futures, we do have to integrate the idea of brittleness into those futures, the idea of anxiety into those futures, the idea of nonlinearity into those futures, the idea of incomprehensibility, as well as it's not necessarily entirely an either or choice. We can choose to focus on Banny as our primary framing, but we also have to recognize, as I've said, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity already baked in. So that's a part of it too. So I think the duty of foresight, next definition, foundationally provides boards with their mandate. Stand up for your successors' futures. Examine those futures. Understand that the futures we're talking about, if we were to sit down and have a conversation with a board and talk about 2034 futures, right? March 2034 futures. If we were to do that, the futures we're talking about don't belong to them. Those aren't their futures. Those futures belong to the successors who will come in these next 120 months, who will never be known to them. They will most likely never meet those people, right? Even though those people are maybe somewhere near the systems for which they're responsible, they may be going through their educational process right now. But in 120 months' time, when they're part of those systems, in all likelihood, the boards sitting today will never know who they are. We've got to take that responsibility very, very seriously. And so it requires us to imagine futures that will not make us happy, right? And that will not make anyone happy, that we want to avoid. And the only way we're going to have any chance of trying to steer away from them and towards something else is by confronting them now, right? Through the process, through the work of foresight, with a consistent duty to do so and to build that capacity over time and to pass it on as a capability that exists in our organizations in an enduring way. So for me, it could not be more consequential that we undertake this work with the seriousness of purpose that it deserves, because it's not for us, really. It's for those to whom we have responsibility going forward. And the more that we can do what we do for them in a way that perhaps our predecessors didn't do consistently for us, that accrues to our successors' benefit, but it also speaks well of us and our responsibilities.
Well, Jeff, as we wrap up, I want to put one more question to you. And I know you work with lots of boards and lots of association executives. So as a result of your work with the duty of foresight, how do you see the role of the chief staff executive evolving with the board of directors?
So, I think there's always going to have to be, appropriately so, an aspect where, the board has to have some measure of distance from the CEO and management team, because there is an oversight function, right? That oversight function is not going to go away. So we want to make sure, and when I say distance, I don't mean that, it needs to be personally distant. There just needs to be an independence, right? It's probably a better word to say. There needs to be an independence in the way that the board is approaching some of the traditional activities that I referenced earlier. But really going forward, this has got to be a genuine collaboration. We've been talking about board staff partnership my entire career. I think mostly what I've seen versus what I've heard is lip service, is what people say, we need partnership, but that's not really what happens. Or it happens only in certain cases and not completely. I think we need to have much better collaboration, that, for example, with artificial intelligence, when I talk about the idea of ethical, purposeful, and responsible adoption of artificial intelligence, the only way that's going to happen is if boards and CEOs are working together on this. We can't just in a sort of haphazard fashion introduce the riskiest technologies that our organizations have ever been asked to contemplate into our organizations without a conversation, without a true collaborative exploration of the issues raised by these technologies, and specifically, most concerningly, generative AI. But it's not all AI has various issues that we have to consider. Generative AI has a far more complicated and really concerning issues. But ultimately, it's got to be a collaborative endeavor in which the board understands its stewardship role in all of this, its responsibility to lead the organization better than how it found it, and to do so in an AI-specific context. How do you make sure that the introduction of AI values the same ethical principles that the organization would value in any context, right? Ethical decisions must be made first is a way that I think about it. That's got to be a collaborative endeavor between the board and the CEO. The same is true with the purposefulness of the use of the technology. Why are we doing this? Let's have purposeful use cases for this, around the implementation of artificial intelligence. And let's make sure we're doing it responsibly by being open about it, having disclosure being a fundamental part of what we do, documentation of how we do it. There's so many more aspects to it, reporting, public reporting around our activities. There's so many more aspects to it as well. So I just wanted to offer that as an illustration of the kind of collaboration that we need. And it's collaboration between the board and the CEO, and also other staff partners, certainly the C-suite partners, lots more interaction between the board, CEO, and C-suite partners, as well as other staff contributors, especially on issues like AI, which are very complex and incomprehensible. And so we want to bring in that expertise into the conversation. So I think that collaboration has got to be real and meaningful, and it is going to require a different way for boards to see their CEO, not simply as the person that they employ on behalf of the association, but to see that person as a genuine partner to help them be successful, and they help the CEO be successful. And the staff, the remaining staff members, are there to support both, to support their CEO and to support their board in moving the organization forward. And I see some, some examples of that emerging. I hope that we'll see more of that. It's something that I expect that I'll be working on more, especially as I'm doing more work in the area of artificial intelligence and wanting to cultivate, really nurture that way of looking at things. I just think that that's going to be necessary to seriously advance the idea of not only the duty of foresight as an essential part of what boards do, but to really build our boards to become fit for purpose, for them to become more. I like to say association boards must become more. Let's make them more in 2024 and going forward. And I think it's a combination of our commitment to stewardship, our commitment to making governing a future adaptive process, and to really building in that capacity for foresight. And it's all grounded, it's all centered on the core of this way of thinking is the board's duty of foresight. So I think that's what we need, and that's what I hope we'll continue to work on as this decade continues and we look toward the 2030s.
Well, Jeff, you're far more than just a contrarian, at least from my perspective. You're one of the best thinkers in the association community, offering a real opportunity for the associations to maintain their value to our society and our communities. And I want to thank you for joining me today. And I want to thank our audience for listening. The best way to reach Jeff, if you're watching this on video, you'll be able to see it, is through his LinkedIn account, or you can go to his website at Foresight First. It will be enjoyable. There's wonderful articles there. Jeff, thank you so very much. Have a wonderful day, wonderful time, and we'll see you soon. And for our audience, we'll see you in a couple weeks. Have a great day, folks.